Biggest issue that's making news here at the United Nations in New York is sustainable development and climate change. Two issues that Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be looking at addressing during the United Nations Sustainable Development Summit. I'm being joined today by Ian Keith, who is the campaigns manager of Awaaz Foundation here in New York. Also joining me is Mr. Somnath Mukherjee, who is the development coordinator of Association for India's Development. A lot is being spoken of when it comes to sustainable development, when it comes to the pledge that India has to make when it comes to climate change and development of India. Somnath Mukherjee, what is it that Prime Minister Narendra Modi should be looking at in terms of commitment during the summit of the United Nations Sustainable Development?
Thank you. So one of the first thing that comes to my mind are the largest proportion of India's population by profession are our farmers. And today the farmers in India are in the worst of the worst conditions. The highest number of suicides by the percentage is by the farmers, and that is because of policy adjustments on one hand, and on the other hand effects of climate change, which is forcing the farmers to leave the agriculture, the profession of agriculture, and take to other professions which are temporary and insecure. So tying into the UN Sustainable Development Goals are of reducing poverty, reducing inequality, increasing economic security, taking care of the ecology. All these things tie into sustainable agriculture, and I would say that should be one of the prime agenda for the Prime Minister for India in meeting the Sustainable Development Goals.
Ian, as part and campaign manager for Awaaz Foundation, you're looking at the larger picture, the bigger picture of climate change. We know that Pope Francis is going to be here. He's going to talk about climate change. A lot of push from President Barack Obama, who wants to be the climate hero. When the two meet, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi meets with President Barack Obama, what is it that US would really expect out of India in terms of commitments on climate change?
Yes, well, firstly, welcome to New York. I think we're in a particularly exciting time on climate. You know, you mentioned the Pope earlier. He just came out with the encyclical that concretely states the moral case for action on climate change, in particularly through this lens of it impacts the most vulnerable, the poorest among us, disproportionately. It's exciting as well because we're expecting potentially tomorrow for the Indian government to come up with its offer for Paris. We are now 3 months away from the next big UN climate summit, which is taking place in Paris in December. And it's going to be the first time that all countries, every single country in the world, have put forward a plan on what they intend to do. The issues that we're particularly looking at is how quickly India is going to transition to a renewable energy economy. There are 1,200 planned power plants, coal power plants. Coal is one of the most polluting sources in terms of climate change. It also causes air pollution. I know that earlier this year, Delhi was named as one of the worst cities in the world in terms of air quality. Half of the world's proposed coal power plants are in India. So there's a question, I think, is the Indian government going to seize the opportunity and the momentum this year and move rapidly towards renewable energy and kind of get that first mover advantage in this race to the next industrial revolution, which is essentially what we're talking about here? Or are they going to continue to support a lot of the state-owned fossil fuel infrastructure that we're seeing?
Well, so not
move rapidly towards renewable energy and kind of get that first mover advantage in this race to the next industrial revolution, which is essentially what we're talking about here? Or are they going to continue to support a lot of the state-owned fossil fuel infrastructure that we're seeing?
Well, Somnath Mukherjee, can India really do it and transition to renewable energy as soon as possible, as Ian has been putting it? Or is there a price to pay, given that more effects of climate change is visible now than ever before in India, in the agricultural industry, when it comes to the farmers or the fisher folk?
Yes, I think it is possible, and it has to be made possible because we have but one planet to live on. It has to be made possible, right? It has to be made possible. And one thing we need to look at closely is if we relate per pound or per kilogram of greenhouse gas emission to improving economic status of the population of India, we need to disaggregate the data and see how it is benefiting disproportionately the rich and the poor of India. The inequality is more than ever. And the more we spend on, the more greenhouse gases we are emitting, it is increasing this inequity. So one of the things to focus as far as green energy is concerned, or any energy is concerned, is how do we distribute that energy within India to reduce the inequity. On the one hand, if you go to Mumbai, Delhi, Kolkata, there is like a flood of lights. 5, 10, 20 kilometers from the city, you will go to the villages, at least mostly in eastern India, they are still in darkness. So this kind of inhuman inequality is just unconscionable. That is what we need to fix, and I think there would be enough energy in this world, in India, to light every home and every street.
Well, Ian, coming to you, first movers advantage is what you were talking about, but India has its own perspective and its own way of thinking when it comes to first movers advantage. They say that the West had the advantage, and if India is put in the position of reducing its carbon footprint, then they are going to be at great disadvantage. Is that argument fair? Is India's argument of certain sections saying that they're being arm twisted by the West fair?
I think there's no escaping the fact that there are broken promises from the West. So at the last round of international climate talks in Copenhagen in 2009, $100 billion was pledged to help countries develop more cleanly and adapt to the impacts of climate change. We've only seen 10% of that so far. So from the Indian government's point of view, they're being asked to come to the table again, renegotiate a climate treaty, and what was promised in the last round still hasn't been delivered. So that is absolutely accurate, I think, to say that there is a fairness issue here. However, when you look at what's happening with the renewable energy growth around the world, it's not necessarily the West that's winning. China, $83 billion of investment in renewable energy last year alone. India, $7 billion. So India is potentially in this space where it could get left behind. All over Africa as well, you're seeing rapid growth in renewable energy. We're talking about rural development and farmers. One of the things that's most fascinating about renewable energy is it takes power out of the hands of the big corporations and decentralizes it. It gives rural communities control over their own destiny, over their own economic prosperity. And that's potentially very powerful. We're seeing as well how it can be a form of stopping corruption because you're distributing that political and economic power. So I think it's a very exciting time for India, but there is a clear choice here. Do we go down the coal route, or do we continue and increase our investment in solar and wind?
Varied subjects here, but they coincide, Somnath Mukherjee. It seems like while China is doing very well in terms of how they're managing the issue of climate change, but in terms of sustainable development, they've not gone far enough. And that really puts a question mark as to how should one balance the two out.
Yes, so India, as you know, has a large population who are dependent on the land, on the water, and the issue of climate change affects them directly. India has a coastline of about 7,500 kilometers, and crores of people are dependent on fishing and fishing-related livelihoods, and so are the farmers. And the issues of climate change affects them directly. The monsoons have shifted. Rainfall comes, we get a lot of rainfall in a very short period of time. So our staple crops like paddy and wheat get destroyed in that. When farmers are sowing the first saplings, they get flooded. And so this leads to not only the food insecurity of the farming families, but also of the entire nation. So focusing on climate change means actually focusing on the poor population of India in one way, and focusing on the privileged population of India who have the capacity to emit a lot of greenhouse gases, which the other half doesn't have.
Well, final question, Ian. What are the biggest challenges that lie ahead when it comes to sustainable development and climate change for India vis-a-vis the global community?
I think, On the table for the Paris negotiations right now is a shared global target for the world to decarbonize the global economy. The easiest way to get there is through 100% clean energy, where we take our cities, we take our rural communities, and we power them with clean energy, not dirty fossil fuels. The big challenge right now for India on the world stage is that it's hard for them to support that, because it breaks down this idea that essentially there's always had to be a distinction between northern and southern countries in terms of their commitments. Now, what we're hoping for Paris is that we get the right financial infrastructures and incentives in place that facilitate other countries coming to the table and saying, okay, we're willing to transition to clean energy because you're putting in place the structures that we need to make that happen. But we need countries like India to get behind this idea that Paris can send a signal that the world as a whole needs to transition away from fossil fuels. And that is going to be a very big challenge for the Indian government, and we would support them in moving in that direction.
Well, on that note, it seems like we should be looking forward to the UN Sustainable Development Summit, as also COP21, which is going to be huge for climate change and on climate change. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has spoken of how food security is important and how it is important to ensure that every household, every person in India raises his or her level when it comes to per capita income. But that can only happen when the country and the Prime Minister focuses on sustainable development and also climate change, because that certainly is impacting each and everyone in India. Thank you, Ian, for joining us, as also Somnath Mukherjee for joining us on this discussion.